The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel sharper. I found myself sitting across from her, a warm light from the lamp casting soft shadows across her face. There was something effortlessly graceful about her. 40-something, confident, yet with a vulnerability that flickered beneath the surface. We weren't exactly close, not in the way that people share their deepest thoughts. But tonight, something felt different. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting in a way that caught me off guard. "Want to hear a secret?" she asked, her voice low and playful, a hint of mischief dancing around the words. The question felt like a spark in the otherwise ordinary evening, and my heart skipped a beat without me even realizing it. Without thinking, I replied, "Only if it's about me." She laughed softly, the sound warm and musical, but there was a pause afterward, a lingering look that made my pulse quicken. It wasn't the laughter itself. It was the weight behind her gaze, the way her eyes searched mine as if daring me to lean closer, to notice what she wasn't saying outright. There was a magnetic pull in that moment, subtle but undeniable. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the soft hum of the air conditioner fading into the background. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, something floral subtle, that seemed to hug the space between us. She tilted her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and the gesture felt deliberate and intimate even though it could have been entirely accidental. Every small movement held a new layer of meaning I wasn't used to reading. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that she was just teasing, but the way she was leaning forward, her hands resting casually on the table, fingertips brushing the edge, made me aware of how near she was. It wasn't about the words. It was about presence. The quiet confidence in her posture, the gentle curve of her smile. It was all drawing me in without her needing to say another thing. I caught myself stealing glances at the subtle lines of her face, the way her lips curved when she smiled, the quiet steadiness in her eyes that hinted at experiences I could only imagine. I realized I was curious not just about the secret she had promised, but about her, about the way she carried herself, about the world she seemed to hold just behind her calm exterior. "Are you serious?" she asked after a moment, breaking the silence with a soft chuckle. I nodded, feeling the heat rise in my chest, because in that instant, I wasn't entirely sure if my curiosity was about the secret or about her. She leaned back slightly, still smiling, and the unspoken tension hung between us, delicate, electric, and impossible to ignore. In that moment, I understood nothing about this was ordinary. One question, one teasing glance had changed the atmosphere entirely. And as we both laughed softly again, I realized that the night had begun, that the spark of curiosity had been lit, and that there was no turning back from the quiet pull between us. The laughter from the first spark lingered in the room, soft and almost fragile, like a candle flickering in a quiet evening. She leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing, but the corners of her eyes still held that glimmer of something unspoken. She didn't rush to reveal her secret, and I realized I didn't want her to. The anticipation hung between us, subtle yet potent, like the calm before a storm. We drifted into casual conversation. At first, it was the ordinary, how her day had been, what little quirks he noticed about our neighborhood, the mundane frustrations of work. But as the words flowed, I realized she was listening differently. There was an intensity in the way her eyes followed me, a softness in her tone when she asked me about things that mattered to me. It wasn't just polite interest. It felt like she wanted to understand me in a way few people ever did. "What keeps you awake at night?" she asked suddenly, tilting her head, a playful but genuine curiosity in her voice. I hesitated, caught off guard by the intimacy of the question. No one had asked me that in years, not really. I laughed nervously, but she didn't push. She simply waited, patient, letting the question linger in the air until I spoke. As I spoke, describing restless thoughts and small worries, I noticed the subtle changes in her expression. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass absent-mindedly, a small nervous habit she didn't seem aware of. Her gaze softened when I paused, and I felt a warmth radiate from her presence, steady and grounding. It wasn't just that she was listening. It was that she cared enough to let me speak without interruption, without judgment. Occasionally, she would laugh lightly at something I said, but her laughter wasn't the same teasing playfulness from before. It was gentler, warmer, carrying a hint of vulnerability she didn't show at first glance. I realized she was revealing pieces of herself too, in subtle ways. How she absent-mindedly twirled a lock of hair around her finger, how she paused before answering, as if weighing her words, and how her eyes occasionally drifted to mine, holding unspoken questions. The air between us felt charged yet comfortable, a strange combination of excitement and quiet reassurance. I found myself noticing things I hadn't before, the faint scent of her perfume lingering, the delicate rise and fall of her shoulders when she breathed, the gentle curve of her smile when she considered my words. Each detail made the ordinary setting feel more intimate, more alive. For a moment, I caught myself imagining what it would be like if we shared more than this small space of conversation. If the ordinary became extraordinary simply because we were together. But I pushed the thought aside, careful not to let the intensity of the feeling overwhelm me. She finally leaned back, stretching lightly, her eyes meeting mine with a look that was teasing yet thoughtful. "I suppose you'll find out the secret eventually," she said softly, almost as if daring me to ask. I nodded, feeling the pull of curiosity stronger than before, but also something else. A quiet awareness that the connection forming between us was more significant than a mere secret. In that small, ordinary moment, I realized that the real secret wasn't something she was holding back. It was how she made me feel, calm, curious, alive. And perhaps, in some unspoken way, she felt the same. The days that followed were filled with small, seemingly ordinary encounters. But with each one, the air between us grew heavier, charged with something neither of us could name. We would meet casually, a shared coffee, a brief walk through the park, or an accidental meeting in a quiet hallway. But every moment felt as though it carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. I noticed her in ways I hadn't before. How the sunlight caught the warm tones in her hair, how the curve of her smile softened when she laughed at something mundane, and how her eyes, even when she wasn't looking directly at me, seemed to linger on my presence. The age difference, which had seemed so distant at first, now felt like an invisible thread connecting us, subtle yet undeniable. One evening, we found ourselves walking side by side under the dim glow of streetlights. The city was quiet, the usual hum of traffic softened to a distant murmur. Our conversation drifted naturally, from books we had read to small frustrations at work. But there was a new layer, a rhythm in the silence between words. Every so often, her arm brushed against mine. The contact was accidental, or so we told ourselves, but each touch sent a jolt that made me acutely aware of her nearness. At one point, she paused, adjusting the scarf around her neck. I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, a small human imperfection that made her feel even more real to me. I wanted to reach out, to steady her hand or tuck the scarf more carefully, but I held back, respecting the space between us. Even in restraint there was intimacy, an understanding that these small gestures, these moments of observation, carried their own weight. Her laughter had changed too. It wasn't just playful anymore. It carried warmth, a softness that made the quiet streets feel alive. And when she laughed, I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for her eyes to meet mine, to see if she noticed the same pull that I did. Sometimes they did. Sometimes, she looked away quickly, and I felt the brief sting of longing, a reminder that we were dancing on the edge of something forbidden yet irresistible. We shared glances that lingered just a moment too long, smiles that felt like invitations, and silences filled with questions neither of us dared to voice. The tension was gentle, teasing, yet undeniable. It was in the way she tilted her head, the almost imperceptible pause before she answered, and the warmth of her shoulder brushing mine when we moved too close. By the end of that evening, I felt as though the ordinary world had faded, leaving only the two of us suspended in a delicate space of possibility. I understood then that what was forming between us wasn't casual interest or fleeting admiration. It was something deeper, fragile, and electric. A connection that demanded patience, attention, and care. And in that quiet, charged space, I realized I was no longer waiting for a secret. I was waiting for her. It was one of those evenings that seemed ordinary at first, quiet, unremarkable, but I could feel the subtle charge in the air the moment she entered the room. There was a calmness to her movements, a grace that made everything else seem secondary. Yet beneath that composed exterior, I sensed an underlying nervous energy, a tension she carried with a delicate awareness. She moved closer, as if compelled by some invisible force, and my chest tightened in response. "I suppose it's time," she said softly, almost to herself, before meeting my eyes. There was a pause, and in that moment the ordinary world fell away. I knew she was about to reveal something beyond teasing or playful words. I tried to brace myself, but the anticipation made it impossible to steady my breathing. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice dropping into a quieter, more vulnerable tone. "The secret is, I like how you make me feel." She hesitated, as though the admission itself scared her, and then added almost under her breath, "You make me feel lighter, younger, like I can breathe differently when you're around." Her words landed softly, yet they carried weight. I was stunned, not because of what she said, but because of how deeply it resonated. It wasn't the kind of confession one shares lightly. It was honest, raw, and terrifying in its intimacy. I wanted to respond immediately, to tell her that I felt the same, but I paused, letting the words hover between us, fragile and precious. Her eyes searched mine, waiting for a flicker of recognition, a sign that I understood. For a moment, the room was silent except for the subtle sounds of breathing and the faint hum of the distant city outside. It was as if time itself had slowed, making every heartbeat, every glance, and every subtle shift in her posture feel magnified. She shifted slightly closer, and I noticed the small things I had never seen before, the way her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, the faint tremor in her hand as if she were holding herself together, the curve of her lips that hinted at both hope and fear. I realized that this moment was delicate, suspended on the thin line between vulnerability and retreat. I didn't speak at first. I let my gaze linger, letting her see that her words had landed, that they had not been lost or ignored. And in that silence, I felt a new closeness forming. The air between us had changed. It was no longer just curiosity or playful tension. It was recognition of something real, something unspoken that we both had been dancing around for weeks. Her shoulder brushed against mine as she shifted, a fleeting, electric contact that made my pulse race. It was more than accidental. It was a statement, a bridge between the words she had spoken and the feelings that neither of us had yet fully articulated. I realized then that the secret was never just about what she had said. It was about the trust it took to say it, the courage to allow herself to be vulnerable, and the quiet acknowledgement that something between us had changed irreversibly. And in that suspended moment, I understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The warmth from her confession lingered in the air, but almost immediately, I sensed a shift. She leaned back slightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a nervous grace, and forced a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm ridiculous," she said lightly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the tension she tried to hide. It was as though the secret, once spoken, had become heavier than she expected. The vulnerability she had shared hung between us, fragile and electric, and I could feel her instinctively putting up a barrier. Her shoulders straightened, her posture stiffened, and a subtle distance returned to the space between us. I understood immediately. She was retreating not because she didn't mean what she said, but because the weight of that honesty frightened her. I too felt the pull of hesitation. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, to reassure her that her words weren't a burden, that the feelings she admitted were reciprocated. But another part of me hesitated, aware of the age gap, of the invisible social expectations that hovered around us. What if I misread her? What if acknowledging this connection changed everything in ways we weren't ready for? Her gaze wandered, falling to the rim of her glass, tracing invisible patterns across the table. The sparkle that had been in her eyes earlier dimmed slightly, replaced by a quiet apprehension. I watched the faint tremor of her fingers as she set the glass down, and I realized how human she was, how real and delicate. And that realization made the desire to comfort her ache all the more. In my own chest, a storm of conflicting emotions swirled. Admiration, longing, respect, and fear mingled together, each demanding attention. I recognized the hesitation in myself mirrored in her movements, the subtle ways we both guarded our hearts even as we leaned toward one another. It was the tension between wanting to cross the line and fearing the consequences, between craving closeness and fearing vulnerability. She finally met my eyes again, but her look was fleeting, almost apologetic. "I shouldn't have said anything," she murmured, half to herself, half to me. I wanted to tell her that she had nothing to apologize for, that her honesty was a gift, but the words stuck somewhere between thought and voice. Instead, I nodded slowly, letting her know without speaking that I understood, without shoving her back into the safety of pretense. The quiet between us stretched, filled with a tension that was almost tangible. Each movement, each glance, carried meaning now. The brush of her shoulder against mine as she shifted, the way her fingers lingered near mine before retreating, the soft exhale she didn't bother to hide. Every small gesture reminded me of what was at stake, of how delicate this thread of connection truly was. And yet, even in the hesitancy, there was hope. The brief warmth of her confession hadn't been erased. It was merely waiting for the right moment to surface again. In that silent, charged space, I realized that the pull between us wasn't something that could be ignored. It demanded attention, care, and courage, qualities I suddenly understood we both had to summon if this connection, fragile and electric, was to survive. The quiet tension between us had been building for days, a delicate thread stretched taut with unspoken feelings, curiosity, and hesitation. That evening, it became impossible to ignore. We sat together in the soft glow of a lamp, the world outside muted and distant, leaving only the space between us, intimate, charged, and heavy with anticipation. I could see her struggling with the words she hadn't yet said, the vulnerability she had revealed and then tried to retreat from. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for a moment, she looked smaller, as if the weight of her own feelings was pressing down on her. I wanted to reach across the space, to steady her in some way, to let her know that her honesty hadn't scared me away. It had drawn me closer. Finally, I spoke, my voice quiet but steady. "You're not ridiculous," I said. "And you don't have to hide it. I feel it too." The words hung in the air, deliberate and careful, like placing a fragile gift into someone's hands. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of disbelief and relief crossing her face. Slowly, she let herself exhale, a soft sound that carried the weight of weeks of hesitation. Without thinking, she leaned toward me, her shoulder brushing against my chest. The contact was small, almost accidental, yet electric. The warmth radiating from her side was grounding, calming, and terrifying all at once. Her hand hovered near mine, as though seeking permission, and then rested lightly on my wrist. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. Trust, tentative intimacy, and an acknowledgement that we were both ready to let the moment grow. I placed my hand gently over hers, feeling the softness of her skin and the subtle pulse of her heartbeat beneath my palm. The connection was quiet but profound, a silent conversation without words. In that moment, nothing else mattered, the world beyond that room, the age gap between us, the social expectations. Everything fell away, leaving only us. Her head tilted slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the warm, still air around us. I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she relaxed against my touch, and I realized how much courage it had taken for her to let herself lean in, to let herself be seen in that way. For the first time, the silence between us was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than uncertainty. We didn't rush to speak, to define what this meant, or to label the feelings that had been growing steadily. Instead, we allowed the closeness to exist as it was, tender, deliberate, and intimate in its restraint. I felt a quiet smile form on her lips, and I smiled back, not needing to say anything. The breakthrough wasn't in words or confessions. It was in trust, in presence, and in the simple yet powerful act of leaning in, of letting ourselves be known without fear. By the end of the evening, the tension that had once seemed unbearable had transformed into a quiet, steady warmth, a promise of connection, of understanding, and of something real that neither of us wanted to lose. And in that shared space, I knew that the secret we had been circling all along wasn't just hers anymore. It was ours, fragile and electric, and it would guide the moments to come. The night had settled into a calm rhythm, soft and quiet, as though the world outside had paused just for us. The breakthrough had already occurred, our honesty spoken, our vulnerability shared. But there was still a gentle tension in the air, the kind that follows moments too tender and fragile to be rushed. We didn't speak much as we walked side by side, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. Each step seemed in sync, a subtle reflection of the closeness that had quietly formed over days, weeks, maybe even months. Occasionally, our shoulders brushed, small touches that were electric yet safe, deliberate yet accidental. Each one left a lingering warmth, a quiet reminder of what had changed. I noticed the soft curve of her smile in the dim streetlight, the way her eyes caught mine before quickly flicking away, betraying a mixture of mischief and hesitation. It was a look that made my chest tighten, a reminder that despite all the courage she had shown, she was still carefully guarding pieces of herself. "I think you're dangerous, you know?" she said softly, her voice almost lost in the quiet hum of the city. I glanced at her, curious and amused, and replied with a half-smile, "Only if you let me be." She laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that felt like it could light the darkest street corner. The sound echoed softly in the night air, filling the spaces between our words with warmth and reassurance. For the first time since she had whispered her secret, her posture seemed relaxed, her movements unburdened by doubt or hesitation. Even as we reached the small gate to her door, neither of us hurried. Our hands brushed lightly as she opened it, and for a brief moment, I hesitated, wanting to hold on just a second longer. She noticed, I think, because her fingers lingered near mine before retreating, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we now shared. "I'll see you soon," she said, soft but steady, a promise hanging between the words. I nodded, understanding that the night's confessions had changed us both, but also that the journey was only beginning. She stepped inside, turning once to glance back at me. Her eyes were softer than before, her smile gentle but full of warmth. In that single glance, I felt everything, the curiosity, the attraction, the unspoken understanding that had been growing for weeks. It was a glance that carried reassurance and excitement, a mixture of longing and hope that made my heart ache in the best possible way. As the door closed behind her, I remained on the steps for a moment, taking in the lingering sensation of her presence. The secret had been shared, the tension had eased, and yet there was still a quiet thread connecting us, fragile and potent, stretching across the space between. I knew that this thread would guide the moments to come, delicate yet unbreakable, filled with possibility and promise. In that lingering silence, I understood that what we had shared wasn't just a fleeting spark. It was the start of something rare and real. Something worth the patience, the hesitation, the courage it took to lean in. And even without words, even without declarations, I felt it deeply. This connection, this slow burn, was ours to nurture, and it was only the beginning.